The trauma center at Metropolitan General Hospital hummed with its relentless rhythm that Wednesday afternoon. Dr. Stephen Park barely acknowledged the new nurse as she clocked in for her first shift. Her silver hair was tied back in a simple ponytail, her navy scrubs hanging a bit loose on her frame. She appeared to be somewhere in her mid-60s, moving with a measured, careful precision that made the younger medical staff share subtle glances across the nurses' station. In the physician's lounge during the shift change, Dr. Jennifer Hayes spoke just loud enough for the interns to overhear, wondering aloud if human resources had gotten desperate in their hiring. A few people chuckled quietly. The woman, whose hospital badge identified her as Margaret Sullivan, RN, offered no response. She simply collected her assignment sheet and began making her patient rounds with calm, methodical efficiency.
The subtle disrespect became a pattern over the following month. When Margaret needed an extra moment to access a peripheral vein on a dehydrated patient, the surgical residents exchanged knowing looks. When she requested help navigating the hospital's newly implemented electronic medical record system, the younger nurses sighed with barely concealed impatience. Dr. Park commented to a colleague one evening that she'd probably been retired for 15 years and came back because she missed the routine. The laughter that followed was cruel in its casualness. None of them had any idea who Margaret Sullivan really was. Margaret had indeed retired, but not from civilian nursing. She had served as the chief surgical nurse for a combat support hospital unit, the kind that operated from reinforced tents while incoming rounds whistled overhead, the kind where triage meant choosing which soldiers would receive the limited resources and which ones wouldn't make it regardless. She had spent 28 years in the Army Nurse Corps, including 4 combat deployments across 3 different wars. But Margaret wore no ribbons here, carried no credentials beyond her basic RN license. She had come to Metropolitan General for a reason that had nothing to do with glory or recognition. She came to continue serving in the only way she knew how, quietly and without expectation of acknowledgement. Everything shifted on a cold December evening when the distinctive wail of emergency sirens cut through the normal hospital noise. The automatic doors burst open as paramedics rushed in with a gurney carrying a patient whose tactical equipment was still partially strapped to his injured body. The trauma alert had already sounded throughout the building. Staff Sergeant Derek Lawson, Army Ranger, had been critically wounded during a live-fire training accident at a nearby military installation. A malfunction during a breach exercise had resulted in catastrophic injuries from fragmentation and blunt force trauma. His vital signs were deteriorating rapidly, blood pressure dropping, respiratory rate climbing, oxygen saturation falling despite the non-rebreather mask covering his face. The trauma team mobilized with practiced urgency, but as they began cutting away his gear and assessing the wounds, the scope of the damage became apparent. Dr. Park's confident expression wavered. This wasn't the kind of straightforward trauma case they typically handled. This was complex, multi-system damage, the kind that required not just technical medical knowledge, but combat medicine instincts that couldn't be learned from textbooks.
Margaret appeared in the trauma bay doorway, still in her scrubs from the medical floor where she'd been working. Her eyes swept across the scene, the monitors, the patient, the team's body language, the pattern of injuries now visible as clothing was removed. She processed everything in perhaps 3 seconds. She saw what the others hadn't yet recognized, the specific bleeding pattern that indicated internal vascular compromise, the subtle signs of developing tension pneumothorax, the critical sequence of interventions that would need to happen in exactly the right order if this soldier was going to survive the next 10 minutes. Without raising her voice above the normal trauma bay volume, Margaret spoke clearly. He needs a chest tube on the right side before you move him anywhere, and someone needs to get vascular surgery down here immediately. He's got a femoral artery injury that's being tamponaded right now, but it won't hold.
Dr. Hayes turned toward her sharply, irritation flashing across her face. This was a nurse from the medical floor, not even assigned to the emergency department, certainly not someone with the authority to be giving orders during a trauma activation. She opened her mouth to say something cutting, to put Margaret back in what she perceived as her proper place. But something stopped her. It was Margaret's eyes. They weren't the uncertain eyes of someone overstepping their bounds. They were the eyes of someone who had seen this exact scenario play out dozens of times, who had made these exact decisions when there was no attending physician to consult, no backup team to call. They were the eyes of someone who knew death intimately and had learned how to keep it at bay through sheer skill and determination. Staff Sergeant Lawson's eyes flickered open briefly, his gaze unfocused from pain and shock. Through the haze of his injuries, through the disorientation of trauma, something in his consciousness recognized something in Margaret. Perhaps it was the authority in her voice, the certainty in her movements. Perhaps it was the way she carried herself with that particular bearing that only comes from military service. Or perhaps it was something deeper, something that warriors sense in each other, even when words fail. With tremendous effort, fighting against the weakness flooding his body, he lifted his right hand. It trembled, streaked with blood, but the gesture was unmistakable. He brought it to his forehead in a salute, weak, imperfect, but absolutely deliberate. It was offered with the last reserves of his conscious strength before his hand fell and his eyes closed again. The trauma bay went completely silent for a heartbeat. Margaret's response was instantaneous and precise. Her right hand rose in a crisp return salute, executed with the muscle memory of thousands of repetitions over nearly 3 decades. Then, without pause, she stepped into the trauma bay, and her voice changed. Not louder, but carrying command authority that couldn't be questioned. Listen to me carefully. Right chest tube now. He's got decreased breath sounds and JVD starting. Get me a 36 French. And someone call vascular immediately. Don't wait for CT. He doesn't have time for imaging. Tell them we have an active arterial bleed that's going to let loose the second we move him. This time, nobody questioned her.
Dr. Park found himself following her directions, his hands moving to prepare for the chest tube insertion. Dr. Hayes was already on the phone with vascular surgery, repeating Margaret's assessment word for word. The respiratory therapist adjusted ventilation settings based on Margaret's quiet suggestions. The trauma bay, which had been teetering on the edge of chaos, suddenly moved with coordinated precision. Margaret positioned herself at the head of the gurney, her hands checking airway position, monitoring the patient's neurological status, anticipating complications before they developed. She called out vital sign changes before the monitors alarmed. She identified developing problems, the subtle signs of increasing intracranial pressure, the early indicators of hypovolemic shock, and directed interventions with calm, absolute certainty. He's going to need blood products. Start the massive transfusion protocol and get me mannitol ready. We're going to need it for cerebral edema. Neurosurgery should be on standby. Under Margaret's guidance, what could have been a frantic, disorganized code became something almost graceful, each team member knowing exactly what was needed, when it was needed, and why it mattered. She didn't do the procedures herself. She directed the team, positioned them for success, anticipated their needs before they recognized them. Sergeant Lawson was stabilized, packaged, and on his way to the operating room in 14 minutes. For the severity of his injuries, for the complexity of his trauma, it was remarkable time. Later that evening, after the adrenaline had faded and the trauma bay had been cleaned and restocked, Dr. Park found Margaret in the supply room. She was restocking IV catheters with the same quiet efficiency she brought to every task, as if she hadn't just orchestrated the save of a critically wounded soldier. Dr. Park had spent the time during surgery doing something he should have done weeks ago. He'd looked up Margaret Sullivan. Colonel Margaret Sullivan, U.S. Army Nurse Corps, retired. 28 years of service, 4 combat deployments, Iraq twice, Afghanistan twice, 2 Bronze Stars with Valor Device for actions under fire.
a Silver Star for extraordinary heroism during a mass casualty event in Kandahar, where she'd kept 17 critically wounded soldiers alive through a 12-hour period while their facility was under sustained attack. She had commanded field hospitals in some of the most dangerous places on Earth. She had performed or supervised over 2,000 emergency procedures in combat conditions. She had trained an entire generation of military trauma nurses and combat medics. And she had lost her only child, a son who had been an Army Special Forces medic 6 years ago in Syria. He had died doing exactly what she had taught him to do, saving others, putting their lives ahead of his own. This job at Metropolitan General, this position that everyone had assumed was beneath her capabilities, was her way of continuing to serve, of honoring her son's memory by saving others who wore the uniform, of doing the only work that had ever truly mattered to her. Dr. Park stood in the supply room doorway, searching for words that felt adequate even to his own ears. "Colonel Sullivan, I need to apologize. We had no idea. We should have. I should have."
Margaret turned to him with a gentle smile that held no anger, no resentment. "Dr. Park, assumptions are easy. They're the path of least resistance. Understanding takes effort, intentional effort. And I learned a long time ago, in places far from here, that I don't need validation from people who haven't walked the paths I've walked. I didn't come here for recognition. I came here to work." She paused, her hands still methodically organizing supplies. "That young man tonight, he reminded me of my son. Same age, same bearing, same willingness to put himself in harm's way for others. If I can bring soldiers like him home to their families, then this job means everything. The rest of it, the titles, the respect, the acknowledgement, none of that matters." Dr. Park nodded slowly, understanding flooding through him in a way that felt almost physical. "He saluted you. Even in that condition, even barely conscious, he knew." "Warriors recognize each other," Margaret said simply. "It's something you can't fake and can't hide, no matter how much time passes or how far you get from the battlefield. He knew I understood what he'd been through, because I'd been there too. That's all the recognition I've ever needed." Staff Sergeant Derek Lawson's recovery was long and difficult, requiring multiple surgeries and months of rehabilitation, but he survived, against odds that had initially seemed insurmountable. Before he was transferred to the VA hospital for continued care, he asked specifically to see the nurse who had saved his life that night in the trauma bay. When Margaret entered his room, he was sitting up in bed, still connected to various monitors and drains, but alert and improving. The moment he saw her, he moved to salute again, this time properly, with the strength that had returned to his limbs. "At ease, Sergeant," Margaret said softly, returning his salute before pulling a chair next to his bed. "How are you feeling?" "Alive, ma'am, thanks to you." His voice was rough but sincere. "The surgeons told me what you did, how you knew exactly what I needed. They said you saved my life before I even made it to the OR." Margaret took his hand, her grip firm and warm. "You saved your own life by being strong enough to hold on. I just helped point everyone in the right direction. Now your job is to heal, to work hard in rehab, and to live well. Make this second chance count, Sergeant. Live for the brothers who didn't make it home. That's the best way to honor them." Tears welled in his eyes. "My team leader didn't make it. The same accident. He died at the scene."
Margaret's expression softened with understanding. "Then you live for him, too. You carry his memory, his sacrifice, and you make your life mean something. That's what warriors do. We carry each other forward." They sat together in comfortable silence for a few moments, two soldiers who understood loss and sacrifice in ways that civilians never quite could. After that December night, Metropolitan General's Trauma Center was fundamentally different. Not because the protocols changed or the equipment improved, but because the staff's perspective had shifted entirely. Margaret Sullivan was no longer seen as the older nurse who moved too slowly and asked too many questions. She was recognized for what she had always been, a highly skilled trauma specialist whose experience dwarfed that of everyone in the building combined. The younger nurses sought her guidance during difficult cases, learned from her calm demeanor during crises, absorbed her teaching about prioritization and clinical decision-making. The residents asked her to review their trauma assessments, valuing her insights that came from years of making life-and-death decisions under fire. Dr. Park began inviting her to trauma simulation training, where her feedback transformed how the team approached mass casualty scenarios. But Margaret herself remained unchanged. She still restocked supplies with quiet efficiency, still took the assignments no one else wanted, still worked night shifts and holidays without complaint. She had never sought recognition, and receiving it now didn't alter who she was or why she came to work each day. 3 months after Staff Sergeant Lawson's trauma, the hospital administration learned of Margaret's background through Dr. Park's recommendation for a Clinical Excellence Award. They wanted to hold a ceremony to publicly recognize her service, both military and medical. Margaret politely declined. Instead, she made a simple request that the hospital establish a fund to support continuing education for nurses interested in trauma and emergency care, particularly those who wanted to serve military populations. She donated the first contribution, the bonus that came with the Clinical Excellence Award she'd tried to refuse. "Recognition is fleeting," she told Dr. Park when he asked why she'd turned down the ceremony. "Education is lasting. If we can train the next generation to be better prepared, to have the skills they need when moments matter most, that's worth more than any award or ceremony."
On a quiet evening 6 months later, Dr. Park found Margaret in the trauma bay after a successful resuscitation of a car accident victim. The patient had been unstable, bleeding internally, and Margaret had once again identified the critical interventions that made the difference between life and death. "How do you do it?" he asked her. "How do you stay so calm when everything is falling apart? How do you always know exactly what to do?" Margaret was quiet for a moment, her eyes distant with memory. "In Kandahar, during my 3rd deployment, we had a night where we received 37 casualties in 4 hours. Soldiers, civilians, children. More wounded than we had beds, more critical patients than we had ventilators. I had to make choices that night that no one should ever have to make. Decisions about who we could save and who we couldn't, who would get our limited resources and who wouldn't." She turned to look at him directly. "I learned that night that panic is a luxury you can't afford when lives depend on you. You can fall apart later, after the crisis, after everyone who can be saved has been saved. But in the moment, you have to be the calm in the storm. You have to be the steady hand and the clear mind that others can depend on." Dr. Park nodded slowly. "Is that why you came here? To keep being that person?" "I came here because it's the only way I know how to be. My son used to say that we don't serve for recognition or glory. We serve because someone has to stand in the gap between life and death, and we have the skills to make a difference. After he died, I could have stayed retired, stayed safe in my grief, but that wouldn't honor who he was or what he believed. So I came back to work, to stand in that gap for as long as I'm able." "He would be proud of you," Dr. Park said softly. Margaret's eyes glistened, but her voice remained steady. "I hope so, and I hope that every life I help save, every family I help keep whole, adds up to something that makes his sacrifice mean more. That's all any of us can do, take our pain, our loss, our experience, and transform it into something that serves others. Years passed at Metropolitan General, and Margaret Sullivan became a permanent fixture in the trauma center. New residents rotated through and quickly learned that the silver-haired nurse with the quiet demeanor knew more about emergency medicine than most of the attending physicians. Medical students requested rotations specifically to learn from her. Other hospitals tried to recruit her, offering higher pay and prestigious titles. She stayed where she was, working her shifts with the same steady dedication she'd brought from day one. On the 10-year anniversary of her son's death, Margaret requested a personal day, the only one she'd ever asked for in her years at the hospital. She spent it at Arlington National Cemetery, standing at his grave, telling him about the lives she'd saved, the nurses she'd trained, the difference she was still making in his name. When she returned to work the next day, there was a letter waiting for her at the nurses' station. It was from Staff Sergeant Derek Lawson, now fully recovered and serving as a training instructor at Fort Benning. He wrote to tell her that he'd gotten married, that he and his wife were expecting their first child, that every day he woke up grateful for the second chance she'd given him. He was naming his son after his team leader, who had died in the accident, and giving him the middle name Sullivan in Margaret's honor. Margaret read the letter twice, then folded it carefully and placed it in her locker next to a photograph of her own son in his uniform. The young staff nurse who had witnessed this asked quietly, "Good news?" Margaret smiled, and for the first time in years, it reached all the way to her eyes. The best kind of news, a reminder that the work we do here matters, that the lives we save go on to create more life, more love, more meaning. It's everything we serve for, all contained in one letter. That evening, as Margaret made her final rounds before the end of her shift, she paused at the trauma bay. It was quiet now, cleaned and ready for whatever emergency might come through the doors. She thought about all the lives that had passed through this room, all the families that had been kept whole, all the soldiers who had made it home because someone knew what to do in their darkest moment. She thought about her son, about the legacy of service he'd left behind, about how she carried that forward every single day. And she understood with absolute clarity that this was exactly where she was meant to be. Not in the spotlight, not seeking recognition, but standing in the gap between life and death, using every skill and every lesson learned through decades of service, making a difference, one patient at a time.
Because some people are born to stand in the gap, to be the calm when everything falls apart, to carry the weight that others can't bear. Margaret Sullivan was one of those people, and the world was better for it.
True expertise walks quietly among us, earned through sacrifice and service, waiting not for recognition, but for the moment when it is truly needed. The greatest warriors often wear no medals, seek no glory, but continue to serve with humble dedication long after the battles have ended.